Hello. This video about Bismarck and the National Liberals is designed primarily for 2 or 3 students in my teaching group who were not able to attend lessons last week. What I'll do here is I'll move fairly quickly through the slides. There are 47 slides in total. Obviously you can pause the video whenever you want, so if you feel I've gone too quickly then pause and replay. And hopefully you've got your lesson resources in front of you, especially the mind map, so you can basically play the lesson exactly as you would, play the video exactly as you would if it were a lesson. It was actually 2 lessons, 2 hours to cover this, so I'm intending to cover it in certainly half that time at least, so I will move fairly quickly. But you can always speak to me next week if you've got any particular questions about this. Okay, so let's move on. Okay, there's a new Quizlet. All the questions there, you can see there are 24 questions, are from Carr, so that's part of the reading which I'll quickly take you through. That's just a reminder of the big picture, so you can sort of see that it's part of depth study. Notice though that, just zooming in a little bit there, that there are the two lessons that this particular topic consists of effectively 2 lessons. Halfway through, when we move into the about protectionism, that is part of the breadth study economy unit. Okay, so you'll need to effectively file your notes in 2 different places for this, or to at least be mindful of the fact that when we start talking about protectionism, that is relevant to section C, the breadth study economy paper. Okay, that little diagram just frames for you, hopefully, the sequencing, the linkage of the ideas for this particular lesson. So we'll start off with who were the National Liberals. We'll need to consider what their ideology was. Then we start talking about Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany, and why he wanted to work with them in the early 1870s. What were his policies? And then the reasons why later on in the 1870s he broke that tactical alliance with them. Okay, so we're covering 10 years of German history here from 1871 to 1879, and you clearly picked up there that there's a shift. In the early 1870s Bismarck worked with the National Liberals, and in the second half of the 1870s he broke that friendship with them, so we need to understand why that was. Supplementary reading, William Carr is very good on this. There's a little shot there of the pages, so it goes into a lot more depth than the textbook, which of course is what we want to be able to access the high grades. Stephen Lee, remember, is excellent for reading effectively modelled A-level essays. There are two essays in chapter 2. The first one is why did his domestic policies change between 1871 and 1890? Obviously you only need to go up to 1879, so be mindful of that when you're reading that. And the second one, what underlying influences helped shape Germany in the Bismarck era? Notice my own notes. I'll upload those to the Padlet page for you so you can download them, but it mustn't substitute reading the actual essays themselves, because remember, with Stephen J. Lee you're learning about the style of essay writing and the style and structure of how to write answers to A-level questions. Okay, and then thirdly, Evans. Remember, Evans is very good because the book The Pursuit of Power is a very, very recent book, so very, very quotable. Look for little quotes, write them down, memorise them, and use them in introductions and conclusions in the final examination. And then I think finally, in terms of business items, remember I've uploaded to the Padlet a useful, it's an Excel spreadsheet, but I've put into it all of the data for all the elections in Germany from 1871 up to 1933, when Hitler took power. And they are represented then graphically, using the colour red for left-wing parties, the colour blue for right-wing parties, and the colour green for sort of centre parties. You do need to know and be able to talk about the elections and bring into your answers the statistics. You've got to be able to articulate the story behind certainly the key elections. And it's just a reminder for you there, to revisit if necessary once again those three crucial concepts. You've got to be absolutely rock secure in talking about socialism, liberalism and conservatism, nationalism, etc., political left, centre and political right. So those 3 YouTube videos play as often as you need, really, until that information is absolutely at your fingertips. If it's not, then basically you cannot really secure a good A-level response. Okay, so here we are. We can now start talking about Bismarck and the National Liberals. So there's the usual mind map. So we will start there with who were the National Liberals and effectively work our way around in that direction in this video. Okay, so map the key points as we go through. So who were the National Liberals? What I'll do in this video is I'll in particular focus on the in a nutshell, okay, that summarises up the key points, and then the subsequent slides that add detail. You can work on those and just add the detail. So in a nutshell, okay, the National Liberals were the largest political party in the Reichstag in 1871. Okay, who did they represent? They represented the middle classes basically, but so industrialists, who were of course the upper middle classes, the new elites as we call them, but also sort of educated and professional middle classes, lawyers, bankers, teachers, etc., etc. In effect, I suppose, largely representing the new growing industrial towns and the voters there, so middle class voters. Okay, they were nationalist. They supported the unification of Germany in 1871, primarily for economic reasons, because a united Germany was good for business. It opened up markets. They also supported the unification because before 1871, when there were lots of small, separate, independent German states, if you were a businessman, say in Mecklenburg-Schwerin, you didn't have a voice in political affairs because the Duke was an autocrat. He made all the decisions himself. It kind of varied from German state to German state. There were parliaments in most of the German states, but generally speaking, power tended to lie more with the monarchs. Now, of course, the newly united Germany that came into effect in 1871 has suddenly created a national government that sits on top of those separate states. And in the national government, there is a national parliament, the Reichstag, that is genuinely powerful. The new imperial constitution says laws cannot be made without the agreement of the Reichstag. So suddenly, the elected representatives of the German people, which was all the German men 25 years and over, have got a genuine voice in the running of this new country. So they're very happy about that because they've now got a political voice that they didn't have before 1871. Okay, so on the whole, they were backers of unification, and therefore they were backers of Bismarck, the leader of the first German government, the first German chancellor. An additional reason to back Bismarck is they feared they were, like Bismarck, they were afraid of the rise of socialism. Think of our social pyramid. Okay, so Bismarck was from the upper class, and here the National Liberals are the middle classes, and socialism was growing at the bottom. So it made sense for these two classes, the upper and the middle, to rally together in a sense because of that common fear of the rise of socialism, which we've covered in a previous lesson. Okay, so however, and there is a however, okay, so although they supported Bismarck, they also wanted Bismarck to introduce greater democracy than they actually had in 1871. As we know, the new imperial constitution in the end did give a great deal of influence to the elites, in particular to the Prussian Junkers. And so they wanted the middle classes in particular to have more political influence than they were given. Yes, 1871 was a big step forward, but they wanted more. The other thing is the National Liberals in 1871 at the beginning were very keen about having a free trade system, getting rid of what we call protectionism. Protectionism is when you've got taxes are imposed on internal and external borders. So if a businessman wants to move his goods around to sell his goods to different parts of Germany or to other countries, he's got to pay taxes to the government. And the National Liberals in 1871 said, we want open borders, we don't want to have to pay taxes, because that would be good for trade. And certainly in 1871, Bismarck at that particular time very much agreed with them. So that's in a nutshell who they were. Now, the details, you can pick those up yourself, so just pause the video. I won't really say much about them. You can see the highlighted points. That's a key figure. They were the largest party. There they are. There's their leader. We've already said that point. As we said, strongly patriotic. They did constantly push for political reform. They wanted greater participation. They are the party of the middle, and they want more and more participation in government. And as we said, they strongly advocated for free trade, getting rid of tariffs. Okay, tariffs are internal taxes that are paid crossing frontiers. So that's their ideology. So there's the big picture, the mind map. There's what we've covered so far. Next one. Okay, Bismarck's attitude in a nutshell. Okay, so Bismarck, the first Chancellor of Germany. His attitude towards the National Liberals was ambiguous. I think the point we're making here is that he both disliked them but also wanted to work with them. Okay, he could see advantages of working with them. So we'll do the dislike at first. Okay, at heart, Bismarck, of course, again, think of our social pyramid. Bismarck was from the upper level. Okay, he was an upper class. He was a Prussian Junker. So the head of the new German government, like the Kaiser, basically believed that power should lie with this group, the upper classes. And of course the National Liberals were from the middle classes. Okay, so at heart he disagreed with their liberal ideology, because the National Liberals, it's got the word liberal in their name, were pushing for more and more influence by the middle classes in government. Bismarck was authoritarian, he was conservative, he opposed any move that would give greater political influence to the middle classes. But, having said that, at that time, in the early 1870s, there were good reasons to work with the National Liberals in the short term. These are key words, short term. And the main reason was economic. It was a new country. Germany was a new country. And if this new country is going to survive on the international stage, remember it's surrounded by enemies like, in particular, France, who wants revenge. Bismarck knew that it's going to have to develop a strong army. Armies in the late 19th century need modern weaponry made in the new industrial cities that are developing. You don't win wars with men charging on horseback anymore. You need industrialised weapons, industrialised, okay? The National Liberals' support is the middle class based in the industrial cities, so you need to work with them, okay? So that was a key reason, an economic reason to work with them. And that's also a political reason, okay? Because you need to pass laws to now manage the economy, and you pass laws by getting a vote in the Reichstag, and the National Liberals are the largest party in the Reichstag. An additional reason, at that time, in the early 1870s, Bismarck was waging a campaign against German Catholics. Now, I won't talk about that because that's the next topic, the Kulturkampf. But to wage his campaign against the Catholics, Bismarck needed support from wherever he can get it, and as it happened, the National Liberals were anti-Catholic. Okay, we'll do that in a later lesson. But that was an additional reason. So the key word here is that word opportunist. Okay, there's a bit of a conflict with Bismarck, ideologically in terms of his basic ideology, his beliefs. He doesn't agree with the National Liberals. He doesn't agree with their liberalism. But in terms of his short-term aims, he needs to work with them and gain their support. Okay, so that's in a nutshell. So, moving on to the slides. This first slide is Bismarck did not agree with them. Okay, because they were middle class and he was upper class. They pushed for greater democracy. They were liberals, whereas Bismarck was authoritarian. Okay, the opposites. But in spite of that, for opportunist reasons, in the short term, he needed to work with them. So, again, you need to be able to articulate this in the examination. And there's more than one reason. The first reason, he needs to win over the middle class. They're the largest party. It always comes back to politics. Okay, certainly in 1871, and in 1874, and in 1877. Well, the situation did change as we moved into the 1880s, but he couldn't ignore them. But he was anxious because they wanted liberal reforms. In other words, to give more power to the middle classes. But he did mainly agree at that time with their economic policies. They wanted free trade. Bismarck could see the benefits of that, okay, because that would strengthen national unification. And ultimately, by working with them on economic policy, he would win the support of the middle classes, and he believed that a modern government, his job was to strengthen Germany. He's got to get the middle classes on his side. So in a sense, it's a kind of trade-off that Bismarck is saying. If you think of the sort of political pyramid, and again we come back to, you've got the upper classes, okay, at the top, and then the middle classes. And Bismarck is from the upper class, so the upper classes, they have political power, and the middle classes, they have much of the economic power. So it's like Bismarck was saying, I'll give you economic influence, but in return the upper classes retain most of the political power. And then the second reason goes back to that sort of picture of, you've got to imagine Bismarck has to walk into the Reichstag and present a proposal. I want a law passed on something. And he's got to look at who the members of the Reichstag are. And Bismarck needed the support of the National Liberals there. And the second party, the Centre Party, okay, at this particular time, Bismarck was waging a form of campaign, an internal campaign against the Catholics who he didn't like. It was called the Kulturkampf, which we'll do next lesson. So Bismarck at that stage in the early 1870s is not going to get the votes of the Catholic Centre Party. They're going to effectively vote against any laws in the Reichstag that Bismarck wants to pass. And so another reason to have the support of the National Liberals, okay, which is the point there. Okay. Okay, so we've covered the first two strands. So the next strand is Bismarck's policies, okay, 1871 to 1873. So, as I said, you've got to sort of visualise that any national policy, if Bismarck wants to pass a law that applies over the whole of Germany, he's got to basically walk into the Reichstag, the elected parliament, okay, that consists of deputies, as we call them. In England we call them MPs, members of parliament. In Germany they were called deputies. And these deputies have been elected by all men over the age of 25, and they all belong to different political parties. And the largest group is the National Liberals. Okay, so in a nutshell, in the early 1870s, Bismarck's main focus was to pass through the Reichstag laws that would strengthen the economic unity of the new German nation. Okay, it's a brand new country. He wants it to strengthen. There's a lot of work to do. Okay, to build the country economically, so he needs to get lots of laws passed. And on the whole, well, very much so, during this period, 1871 to 73, Bismarck was very successful. Okay, he had no real problems. Bismarck would present as the Chancellor, he would present to the Reichstag, I want this to happen, vote on it, and he was able to get these laws voted through. And the reason for that is he had National Liberal support for that. Now, most of these laws were about strengthening the economy, and in particular getting rid of those what we call tariffs, those taxes that businessmen had to pay every time they moved their goods either around within Germany or to other countries. So it was a success. This is what Germany needed at the time. It needed a sort of like a bigger, wider market without taxes, so that businessmen could trade their goods more widely. And as a result, the new Germany was strengthened economically. And we can now, as historians, see that the laws that Bismarck was able to pass with National Liberal support prepared the way for the second industrial revolution that began in the 1890s, and we covered that in a previous lesson. Okay, the first industrial revolution was in the 1850s and 60s. And what Bismarck was doing here is he's sort of strengthening the economy, which prepared the way later on for a further boom in Germany's industry, in particular in the 1890s. So, the detail, again, you can pause and play it, but much of the legislation related to free trade. So the details there, Germans can now travel freely around Germany, so all of those internal, you can see there on the map, the different states, but previously they were separate countries. They still exist within Germany, but now Germans can move around freely, and businessmen in particular. So laws restricting charges of interest on loans are removed, the common weights and measures are standardised, there was a national currency was introduced, the Reichsmark, and goods coming into Germany from other countries like France and from Russia. Russian merchants and French merchants, they had to pay taxes to get their goods into Germany, but they were lightened. The taxes they paid were lightened, so that meant that the goods they sold were cheaper for German consumers. So as a result, those economic barriers were broken down, and that basically helped unify the economic system and prepare the way for the 1890 Industrial Revolution. Okay. Little knowledge retrieval tests which are built into the lesson. I won't go through it, but you can have a go yourself. Pause the video if you want. Just push on. So the next strand, okay. So what we're saying, early 1870s, very successful, but then things began to change with an economic recession that began in 1873. Okay. So, in a nutshell, with hindsight, whenever we use that word hindsight, we're talking about us as historians. We can see that Bismarck's alliance with the National Liberals of the early and the mid-1870s was only short-term. It was a convenient thing to do at that time, what we call an opportunity, grabbing an opportunity. With hindsight, we know that eventually, in the late 1870s, Bismarck rethought his position and broke that alliance. Okay, and one of the key reasons for that, why he changed his position, was that there was a worldwide economic recession. Okay, notice it was worldwide. The world economy went on a downturn, and that hit Germany in the second half of the 1870s. Okay, so a little bit more detail there, with the images. Tells you a bit about the cause. Partly the German economy had expanded too quickly. Okay, often think of economies like a bubble, and if a bubble expands too quickly, what will happen? It could burst. Okay, so the impact is in 1873, about 150 German companies went bankrupt. So the economic growth slowed down, industry contracted. Okay, and in particular, one of the key things was this. Remember what I said a minute ago, that one of the features of the early 1870s with free trade is that merchants from other countries who wanted to sell their goods to the German people were able to bring their goods into Germany without having to pay heavy taxes at the German frontier. And that was good for the German consumers, ordinary people, because it meant that grain, in particular wheat from Russia and in particular the USA, was very cheap. But that basically meant if you were a German farmer, if you're going to compete with the Russian and American grain, the German farmers had to drop the prices of their own wheat. And they struggled now because it was a recession, because to pay for their to manage their farms, they needed to basically purchase services from abroad in particular, and world trade is restricting. So in particular, German farms faced bankruptcy, and why is that relevant? Because who were the German farmers? In particular, the German farmers were the Prussian Junkers, and the Prussian Junkers are the people who are basically in the corridors of power in this new German government. Bismarck was a German farmer himself. The Kaiser was a German farmer. So all of the people who were circling around Bismarck in Berlin making the political decisions are German farmers. So effectively Bismarck came under pressure from his own social class to re-evaluate his political policy. And that really was what it was about. Okay. Problem was compounded by poor harvests in the mid-1870s. That was a factor as well, which likewise damaged German farms. Okay, so again, return to the big picture. We've covered 4 of the strands now. So we now move into this one. Okay, why then did Bismarck move away from free trade, which was his policy in the early 1870s, towards a policy of what we call protectionism in the late 1870s? And in a sense, we have already now answered that question. Okay, let's just go through it in a nutshell. So another reason for Bismarck's break with the National Liberals was that he was under pressure from his own social class, as I just said, the Prussian Junkers, because they were farmers hit by the recession. But also many of the most powerful industrialists, were now rethinking free trade. Free trade had been good for Germany at first. It had created a common currency, etc., etc. But now many of the top industrialists are rethinking this notion of free trade, and in particular they're thinking we don't want cheap goods from other countries coming into the German market because they will undermine our own businesses. So they're thinking we want to abandon free trade and introduce the opposite. Okay, now the word we use when you have trade taxes, tariffs on goods entering Germany, so the opposite of free trade, we call it protectionism. And the reason it's called protectionism is because it is protecting homegrown industry from cheap goods overseas. Okay. Again, if you just think that through, so again, use the example of grain. Okay, so let's say American farmers want to sell their grain to people in Germany. If all of a sudden they now have to pay a tax on the German frontier to get their goods into Germany, when the American farmers arrive in the German towns with their bags of grain, they've got to put the price up, haven't they? Because they've got to cover the cost of the tax that they had to pay to get their goods into the country. So therefore, American grain becomes more expensive. Therefore, German people will be in the markets will be thinking, I'd rather buy German grain because German grain is cheaper. Okay, so therefore, external trade taxes on the German frontiers with other countries has effectively protected homegrown German business. Okay, so the opportunity for Bismarck to break with the National Liberals arose when the National Liberals themselves split. Okay, so there was a division, a rift within the national trades, within the National Liberals, over. So you've got to imagine the National Liberals are a political party. They've been voted for by the middle classes. Now, up until the mid-1870s, they were all together. They all believed in free trade. Now, all of a sudden, they started arguing amongst themselves. Some of them strongly believed we want protectionism. Others strongly wanted to stay with free trade. Bismarck's looking at this, thinking, I want to break with the National Liberals. Aha, I can see a weakness. They're arguing amongst themselves. There's a division within the ranks. So Bismarck, in the late 1870s, launched a campaign that kind of like drove a wedge within the National Liberals by saying, those National Liberals who are arguing they want free trade, they are being unpatriotic because they basically are supporting, the example, American farmers, they're supporting Russian farmers, they're supporting businessmen from abroad by arguing that there shouldn't be tariffs on German frontiers. So conversely, Bismarck said those National Liberals who want protectionism are good, loyal German people because they want to protect German industry. So Bismarck kind of like drove a wedge within the National Liberal Party. Okay, so the details. So for that first point, Bismarck was under pressure, okay, from his own farmers, from his own social class, okay, the Junkers, but also from the German industrialists. So an example there, the Central Association of German Industrialists, and also from his own farmers, okay, and again we covered those points there. They're the economic reasons. Then the political reasons, okay. So in the early 1870s, Bismarck had needed their economic backing. But Bismarck always felt uncomfortable working with people that he didn't really agree with, being dependent on their support, okay. So when suddenly this debate appeared and the pressure was suddenly to move away from free trade, Bismarck was actually quite relieved because it gave him an opportunity to break with a political party that at heart he didn't really enjoy, he didn't really feel comfortable working with ideologically. So the opportunity appeared when there was this division on free trade versus protectionism. So I've represented it as a diagram there, okay? I've simply shown the split here, okay? And as you can see, there's the National Liberals, and the National Liberals on the right wing, a group of them, wanted to move away from free trade towards protectionism, and those more on the left of the party wanted to continue with free trade. And ultimately, that left-wing group broke away and formed a new party called the Left Liberals. Okay, that didn't happen straight away, it happened over time. but that ultimately is what happened. Okay, so Bismarck launched a strong campaign against the left, against that group, the group on the left, because he said any group who wants to support free trade is basically saying cheap goods from abroad can come into Germany. That's unpatriotic. It's weakening our country, because anything left wing is international, and so the left wing national liberals, Bismarck was lumping them in with the SPD and as being internationalist and therefore being unpatriotic, not supporting the newly created Germany. Okay, so that's why protectionism. Doing well. Let's go to the next one. Okay, so the short-term political benefits. So, in a nutshell, Bismarck's campaign against the supporters of free trade weakened, therefore, the political influence of the National Liberals. Okay, which in 1880 actually split into two parties, and the breakaway party were called the Left Liberals. Okay, now that at the time was seen to be damaging. With hindsight, remember that word hindsight is always coupled to us as historians. So as historians, we can actually see the bigger picture because we know what eventually happened over the next few decades. We can now see that that was a major turning point because the National Liberals from that point onwards fell into decline. The original right-wing National Liberals, okay, those that wanted to work with Bismarck because they were protectionist, sort of now very much allied themselves with Bismarck and the upper classes. Okay, and so Bismarck supporters, remember, were the Prussian farmers, the Junkers, and so the group of the National Liberals that's left, they were the big industrialists. They wanted protectionism. They were the producers of big steel, etc. So that alliance between the industrialists, the new elites, and the Prussian Junkers, the farmers, the old elites, was often called the alliance of steel and rye. Rye is another word for grain, food, also known as Sammlungspolitik. So we've mentioned all of that in previous lessons since we began the course 2 months ago. So hopefully you can now, what this lesson has done is put that into context for you and helped you understand that better. Okay. Now that alliance of steel and rye, the alliance of the new elites and the old elites, the big industrialists and the German Prussian farmers, is crucial. It continued into the 20th century, and it's so crucial that when we eventually move into Weimar Germany and look at the rise of Hitler, absolutely instrumental in Hitler being made Chancellor of Germany in 1933 is the alliance of steel and rye was a big factor behind that. Many of these men put Hitler into power. Okay, so that's why it's important. Okay, so the detail. There we are. The campaign weakened the National Liberals. So you need to be able to see that in terms of the election graphs. So there's 1877. The National Liberals were the largest party. 1878, a year later, look what's happened. The National Liberals have lost votes. Okay, they lost 29 seats. And that's largely because of the creation of the Left Liberals. The Left Liberals had different names. Okay, and that's why don't be too confused by some of these graphs because some of you will think, well, the Left Liberals were there in 1877. The transition to a Left Liberal Party happened over time, and they went through various name changes. Okay. But eventually consolidated down into being called the National Liberals. So if you look at a source and it refers to the Liberal Union Party or the German Radical Party, then you need to be aware of that's the earlier version of the Left Liberals. Okay, but don't worry too much about that. The key thing is that what was left, the National Liberals, the original National Liberals, were weakened because of that splintering away of the left liberals, and they never regained the influence that they had enjoyed at the beginning. Never again. Okay, that's the key thing for you to remember and to understand. So protectionism also enhanced the power of the Conservatives in the Reichstag, because you've now got that bloc. Okay, so just zoom in there. So here, so what's left of the National Liberals, the right-wing National Liberals, have now very much allied themselves with the Conservatives, and I've drawn a red box around it. That box, that sort of like block, that grouping of the deputies in the Reichstag who belong to the Conservatives, okay, they're mainly the Prussian Junkers at the voters, okay, the German farmers working with the big industrialists, are now bound together, okay, always to work together to support each other because it's in their interests to do that. Okay, so that's the sort of point there. And the reason this has come together is because they want to protect their businesses, okay? So whether this be big industry in the cities or big farms in the countryside. So the German Conservative Party can now rely on the support of the right-wing National Liberals in the Reichstag. The leaders of heavy industry, big industry, are grateful to Bismarck for moving to protectionism. And that alliance of the big industrialists and the German farmers is called the Alliance of Steel and Rye. And it's significant because it created that bloc, that new conservative elite that worked together with the old elite. We call it a bloc. That's not a spelling mistake. It doesn't have the K. It's a political grouping of like-minded people. We often call it Sandlungspolitik. And it was very important because they're strongly right-wing, and therefore, obviously, as a result of that, they're anti-liberal, they're anti-socialism in particular, and absolutely determined to restrict any attempt at bringing greater democratic change in Germany. And we can see that over the next 40 years, culminating in then putting Hitler into power to make sure that democracy was ultimately removed. Okay, so we've covered that. Now we move into the final strand, which is the economic consequences and the political problems. Okay, so in a nutshell, economically and socially, Bismarck's new policy of protectionism had both benefits and disadvantages. Okay, economically, it definitely strengthened domestic production. It revitalised German industry. There was less competition from abroad. There was, however, a downside. It made German food more expensive for the consumer. Why? Because previously, cheap grain from America and Russia was able to get into the German markets. Now it can't, okay, because tariffs have been put up to protect German farmers. So basically means that German food is more expensive than it was in the early 1870s. What does that mean? It means that the people at the bottom of the pyramid, can we think of that? So protectionism has absolutely helped the upper classes, and it has helped the middle classes because they are the producers of food, but the vast majority of Germans, the lower classes, are the consumers of food, and food is more expensive. So that's going to cause greater resentment. So what you've got is a social divide, a split, a rift appearing between those at the top of the pyramid and those at the bottom of the pyramid. So protectionism did actually increase social divisions. And as you know, the people at the bottom of the social pyramid, the lower classes, if they've got political influence, as they do, because the new Germany gave all men 25 and over a equal vote, these lower classes will vote for the left-wing party, in particular the socialist parties, and the German Socialist Party was the SPD. So, economic consequences, again, this is just the detail. So the economic gains for Bismarck, okay. Know the details. So we often say protectionism formally began in 1879 when Bismarck passed through the Reichstag the protective tariff law. It was backed in the Reichstag by these groups here, okay, the German Conservative Party, the right-wing National Liberals, and some of the Centre Party. Part of the issue with the Centre Party is, remember, they are a Catholic party, but there were rich backers of Catholic. There were rich Catholics who wanted protectionism, so some of the Catholic Centre Party voted for it as well. So protectionism was formally introduced in 1879, and what that did is it made German food more expensive, but it did revitalise industry because it protected German industry from competition abroad. But the downside is it caused economic and social problems because the overall cost of bread went up. That caused working class resentment, particularly in the cities. It deepened the class divide. People were grumbling that the wealthy junker classes were benefiting. So you've got social fracturing, as we call it. Fractures, gaps are appearing in German society. Tensions are appearing. Okay. And then that had a knock-on political impact in a nutshell. So in the longer term, we as historians, that's you, okay, can see that Bismarck's protectionist policies, which caused a split within the National Liberals, did actually create long-term problems for Bismarck. As say, it led to social fracturing, it led to working class resentment. It also led to increased support for the Catholic Centre Party. Okay. Now, we'll do the Catholic Centre Party in the next lesson when we do about the cult of Kampf. But the Catholic Centre Party would often side with the left liberals against Bismarck and his alliance of steel and rye. So Bismarck increasingly struggled to pass laws because of the way politics worked inside the Reichstag, and Bismarck found himself increasingly isolated and quite difficult to manage the Reichstag in the late 1870s. So what does that basically mean? As we said, that what's happened is that green block area there, that's the alliance of steel and rye. So Bismarck's support comes from the National Liberals, those that are left, and his Conservative Party that would always back him. Okay, you've now got a kind of block on the left. Previously it was just the SPD, but the SPD are growing in support, more and more people supporting them, particularly working classes. But notice how the left liberals, those that broke away from the National Liberals, are likewise getting increasing support. So sat in the middle of that is the Centre Party, and the Centre Party are politicians, they're clever people. They know that Bismarck, the leader of the German government, to pass laws through the Reichstag needs to get a majority of votes in the Reichstag. Bismarck can rely on these parties, the blue parties, the National Liberals and the Conservatives, but if the parties on the left are going to vote against Bismarck, then Bismarck needs the vote of the Centre Party. So the Centre Party were crucial, and the Centre Party knew that that was important to them. Okay, so that basically meant that Bismarck was dependent upon the Centre Party. He needed their support. So the rise of the Centre Party, they were the one constant in politics. Other parties tended to gain and lose votes with elections, but the Centre Party, their vote came from Catholics, and Catholics tended to be Catholics. Their vote would stay the same. And suddenly the Centre Party realised that they were like what we call a balancing force. They could decide, do we vote for the parties on the left or do we vote for the parties on the right? And there's a bit of a tug of war there going on, because Bismarck is the head of government. He wants the centre party support. The parties on the left Liberals and the SPD, they're the opposition parties. They want the centre party support against Bismarck. So the centre party will play that for their own favour, but they'll want something in return. So ultimately, that weakened Bismarck. Okay, he's not fully in control. It made him very, very uncomfortable. Okay, when he walked into the Reichstag, he had to make concessions. Okay, to win people's votes. That's really what this is about. Okay, hopefully that makes sense to you. So, the left-wing Liberals who'd broken away, okay, to form the Liberal Union Party, were therefore very successful. There's the point. They were actually gaining more and more support. So the 1871 elections, by 1884, they've become quite an influential group in politics. Okay, so there had been a party that was on the left of politics before the National Liberals split, and basically what happened when the National Liberals split is the breakaway group sort of like joined that party and they became the Left Liberals, if that makes sense. So by the mid-1880s, the two largest parties, the Centre Party and the Left Liberals, were a quite significant bloc who could oppose Bismarck. Okay, and if you look at their votes, so the Centre Party there have got 23%, and the Left Liberals have got about 18%. 23 plus 18 is 41%. It's nearly half the members of the Reichstag. And then if the SPD are growing, add them in, between them, those three parties are starting to control the Reichstag, and that worried Bismarck. So Bismarck was increasingly politically isolated by 1879. And you need to know that because this first depth study is about Germany 1871 to 1879. All the essay questions ask you to talk about those 10 years. So by 1879, Bismarck was struggling. He was no longer in control of the Reichstag, which he was in 1871 when Germany was first created. Okay, there we are. We covered a lot there. Hopefully that was useful to you. As I say, next lesson we will do the Kulturkampf, so the flip learning for next lesson, and that's basically Bismarck's policies towards the Catholics and therefore towards the Catholic Centre Party, which we constantly touched upon in this lesson anyway, so hopefully it set you up well for next lesson. Hopefully that was useful to you. Thanks. This video is now ending. Bye.